Wonderful. Right, so I know this is really redundant to say, but of course, you know, if you type in Chris Verrett, right, of course it'll bring you right to my channel. Chris V Peace also. You can look at, you know, some of the promotional stuff that we've made for San Antonio College, but it also has, you know, just about every class and rotation. Obviously, I'll be putting you guys, it'll say rotation 4, Garcia, and then of course whatever we did that day. And then of course they go in order. However, if there's something that maybe you still have a question about, take a look at maybe the other rotations. Right now, obviously it doesn't always apply to the exact same rotation, but at least sometimes it could be quite helpful. Modeling in Rhino, InDesign, some earlier Photoshop stuff, some different elevation stuff, how to use the laser cutter, some of the rain sticks I was making, how to draw a golden ratio, and of course even some of my work, and as far back as 2020. But either way, at least you know where to go to find it. Again, kind of redundant. If you found this video, then you've already found it. But anyway, let's continue. So the idea of the project is obviously to get a final artboard, and just to kind of recap, you know, a vector means actually a line, right, and a direction, right? If any of you guys have taken physics, you've probably heard about directional vectors or weight vectors, or, you know, 3-body diagrams and things like this. It's really kind of the same thing. It's a component of geometry, and what it means in the computer is that, well, a line is actually a code, and Illustrator is depicting that code to read as a solid line or a dashed line or what have you. Maybe it's a curvilinear line, but regardless, the coding information is all vectorized. Whereas in Photoshop, you may have noticed if you zoom in really close, it's all pixelated, right? That line that you have is actually a set of pixels, not necessarily a coding of a perfect line, right? And of course, I'll show a little bit in Illustrator. What I would say is I don't like to use Illustrator as a drawing tool, right? So, you know, first things first, maybe I would actually want to do something in Rhino first, and I can do that today because, well, let's face it, we all need to usually draw graphic scales and north arrows. So maybe we'll cover that today just in case you didn't know. Or, you know, is this anybody's first time using Rhino? Is maybe my rotation? Yeah, so maybe a few of us. Does everybody have a copy of Rhino? I have a copy for you. It's a student version just in case you actually need it. And of course, talk to me after this video. Anyway, so let's get started. 2 ways we can get started. Well, we can just make a new file in Illustrator. I can switch to inches, and I could quite literally just put in the dimensions that I need. So in case, you know, 3 feet by 60 inches, which would be a 3 by 5. I could set its orientation to landscape or portrait, and I could choose the number of artboards that I want in the first place. So maybe, like I said, maybe I want to cover an entire hallway or a building. I could. In our regards, we just need 1 artboard, thank goodness, right? However, if my studio professor said I need 2 24 by 36s, well, I change that to 24 by 36 and make sure I have 2 artboards, right? So for instance, here we go, right? We have our board. We can assume that it's 3 by 5. However, we can double check. On the Mac, I can choose Command R, and it's going to pop up a ruler. On Windows, it's Control R, right? That's going to pop up your ruler. Now, if you zoom in, of course, that ruler will change. If I hold spacebar, I can essentially pan, right? Which is really nice and a useful tool. I like to often say that when working the computer, it's like a piano. Eventually, you want to learn all the shortcut keys. That way, you don't even have to look and you can play music, right? So you definitely don't just pick up at a piano and know the keys, though. You have to practice, right? So of course, knowing those shortcuts will eventually save you a lot of time, right? However, in our case, I've set up my mouse to also, you know, be able to use, you know, the middle button to, of course, pan too. So there's definitely preferences and things like that. So first things first, I can tell that this is at 0 and of course at 36, and I didn't have to assume, right? However, if I did get it wrong, I could always go to File, Document Setup, and edit my artboards, you know, sort of manually. I can click on this guy and quite literally tell it to be something else, right? So, you know, maybe I accidentally got it wrong or typed in something different, or my studio professor changed it. I can always change that exact same file. I don't have to make a whole new file just because, you know, it messed up or anything like that. Of course, I can click on the outside. Another thing to cover, just in case you've never opened Illustrator before, is there's this little top Windows box. If you click on it, I honestly prefer Essentials Classic. However, at default, I think it's at Essentials. So definitely be curious of that, because if you're on Essentials, you're like, wait a minute, I don't have as many tools as, you know, as Professor Verrett has. So keep in mind that I like to use the Classics. It gives us more options, and it's definitely more there. However, I mentioned we don't ever draw in Illustrator. Honestly, it just takes forever. Don't get me wrong, it is possible. It just takes forever. So in my opinion, I would rather make a Rhino drawing. So I'll go ahead and do that and introduce this aspect of Rhino just in case you don't know it. Now I can just see all of my computer graphics students like, oh come on, this is like kindergarten compared to what we're doing in Professor Verrett's computer graphics class, but I digress. Anyway, we'll go ahead and make a new model. And the first thing that we want to do is actually control the units of the document, because by default it's in millimeters. So I'll type in units, enter, and essentially change it to feet or inches. In my case, I'm going to go with inches. Yes, and we're good to go. Now I could also change it from decimal to feet and inches. I really prefer it. And we can assume that these viewports are our views, right? Obviously we have our perspective view, our top view, front view, and right view. Front and right are basically like an elevational view. And anytime that I'm drawing two-dimensionally, I usually choose a top view because it's more like AutoCAD. Another way that it's like AutoCAD is, of course, well, it has a command bar. I can literally type in just about anything that I want, and it's pretty intuitive of a program. If I need a line, I type in line. If I need a polyline, I type in polyline. If I literally need to know what it is, I type in what, right? So definitely 3 key things to write down. However, the first one, we'll do a rectangle because we need a 3x5. So I'll literally type in 36 inches, enter, and 50 inches, or sorry, 60 inches for 5 feet, enter. And now we have that same familiar bounding box. The reason I want to do that is, well, I eventually want to align anything that I want to this. So as you can imagine, and we'll just do placeholders for today, you know, maybe I have a title up here, right? I can press spacebar again and basically make the same. Maybe my site plan's up here, maybe I've got some process over there. You know, maybe I'm gonna put all of my sections and floor plans in a line, I'm not sure yet. Maybe an elevation here. Oh, that's a pretty good size actually. You can go ahead and copy it. I can hold shift to keep it straight. Also a nice feature. And we'll say maybe that these are perspectives and I don't know, something unique. Another thing that you might notice is when I click on something, this UI device of green, red, and blue pops up. It's known as Gumball, but by default it's not there. So I really recommend toggling it. On the Macintosh, it's on the top of the program. On Windows, it's at the bottom of the program, right? Just to note. But what I like about it is I can really scale just about anything in sort of a free time and get an idea, right? Don't get me wrong, like I said, I'm gonna fill this in maybe with a picture or two, whether I scan it and Photoshop it a little bit and then put it into Illustrator, right? Or I may very well be doing a Rhino model, like, you know, right, let's say one of these actually has my floor plan in it. You guys probably don't have crazy floor plans like this, but, you know, obviously I'm faking it till I make it, Escamilla style. And there's my drawing. Here's my site. Don't you guys have like a triangle site or something like that? Anyway, let's say that was my drawing, right? Well, obviously we'll talk a little bit more about drawing in Illustrator, but I do want to show you this one fact. So another thing that I can draw in here is maybe a graphic scale, right? What scale are you guys using for your drawings? 1/16? Is that kind of the final scale? So typically your graphic scale, how big should it be, guys? 2, 3 inches maybe, right? So we can type in 3 inches, enter. I can hold shift to keep it out. How big is it laterally? Let's say about half an inch. So I'm going to go 0.5 inches, enter. I'm going to type in 3 again, 3 inches, hold shift, and complete my box. I'm going to hit enter again because, well, I only need to draw lines. However, I might need something like a midpoint, right? That's a really unique thing to draw. And if you've ever used AutoCAD, this is very similar to OSnap feature, right? But it's founded on the side here. In Windows, it's actually at the bottom, right? So keep in mind, if I want the midpoint of an object, I can simply toggle midpoint, right, and get that midpoint. However, I might need the midpoint of this line, so I'll draw a new line and get that midpoint, right? What's really nice is if I have Smart Track on, I can find something, I can sort of hover around. That way I don't have to keep making new lines, right? So for instance, I might have to make one here, but can of course make that graphic scale. And if we know anything about the graphic scale, that it basically just halves and halves and halves until infinity. Pretty sweet. We can get fancy with the spices later, right? We don't necessarily have to worry about line weight or anything like that now. However, I do want to help myself out a little bit and go ahead and fill this in. So I'm going to go ahead and hatch it. Another great one to write down. And I want to use a boundary mode because, well, I don't want the whole thing. I just want these pieces. Sweet. Enter. Much better. If I really wanted to get fancy with the spices, I could actually make them lines, right? I could sort of poche them really nicely. You guys remember that from Graphics 1 and Graphics 2? You sat there with a 45 and you were like, you almost got into a trance. It was kind of beautiful for a moment. You had some silence and architecture. But we can change the rotation, right? We can change it into a 45. We can even change the scale, right? So say really big lines. Well, that's kind of ugly. So let's go with something more like 3. Beautiful. But let's say I was done with that. Maybe I actually need to copy it a couple of times. Who knows? And it might actually be a good idea to put them on a separate layer, right? And to even call it graphic scale. Because what's nice is anything that I do here in Rhino, I can transfer immediately and open in Illustrator. So the more organized I am in here, the less time that I spend in Illustrator. So in my case, I just select something, right click on my layer, and change object layer. And we're good to go. I can reposition it. I can copy it. One of the best things about Digital Realm is the ability to copy something. Can't tell you that enough. Never technically have to draw something twice, right? But let's say I was done. I've got things sort of, figured out and stuff like that. I'm going to go ahead and highlight everything and file export selected. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go ahead and try 2 different things. Now, in my case, if you have an old version of Illustrator, it works better to use a DWG. If you have a new version of Illustrator, say like 2023 or 2024, Illustrator files are usually a little bit better, right? So in my case, I still have an old version of Illustrator, and I'll have to use a DWG. So I'm going to go to AutoCAD Drawing, DWG, and I will type rotation 4 part 1, because that will be the name of this video. So we'll go ahead and export, and in my case, it's going to ask me, should ask me, yeah, there we go. We have a number of options. I'm going to choose the first one, 2007 lines. Go ahead and export. It says file successfully saved, and of course the location. So I'll go ahead and minimize that. And well, we did start off with this. Don't get me wrong, that was one way we could just sort of get started, and it depends on what level of drawings that you're going to do. However, in this case, we'll actually want to open up that DWG, right? Because we already made its size, right? So we'll go to where we saved it, rotation part 1. We'll go ahead and open it, and it'll ask me, what do you want to do? Do you want to keep its original size? Well, what size did we make it? The actual size. So yes, in this case, we definitely want the original size, and I want 1 inch to equal 1 inch, and remember the units we put it in? Inches. So just in case you put it in feet in Rhino, what would you have to do? Divide it by 12, right? And in fact, you can actually even put 1 divided by 12, and it's even going to make the ratio for you, right? So if you do 1 divided by 12, you click somewhere else, it's going to automatically do that for you. So it's pretty nice. In my case, I do want it 1-to-1. Doesn't really matter a lot about the other pieces. I'm going to go ahead and press OK and zoom out. Now, as you can tell, something's off, right? In fact, I know what happened. It's 12 times off. So it's not always fail-safe. Let's try again. And you know, I like making mistakes because, well, let's face it, you're going to run into a mistake, and if it doesn't go perfect, you might, you know, run into a panic. So let's try a couple things. Let's go ahead and try again. Rotation 4. Let's try scale to fit artboard. Maybe I don't know the scale. Nice. Well, in my case, I already started with an artboard that was 3-to-5, so of course it fit perfectly. However, I did make a boundary line, and as long as that boundary line that I know is 3x5 fits that 3x5 piece of paper, then I know I have it to scale. I know I make it look like it's too easy, but a lot of this is actually just verifying what I'm doing in a digital realm of space. Because don't get me wrong, it can always look right and be absolutely a tiny little piece of paper. You know, there'd be no way of telling. So again, I can do Command R and make sure that it's of course 0 to 36 inches. Awesome. Right, really from here I just need to change my layers. So for instance, my floor plan drawing, it's a bunch of lines right now. However, I can always take all of these lines and get started, right? I can change, and this is just kind of my rule, we never use pure black on our drawings. Does anybody know why? Because printers suck, right? In fact, they usually print darker than it ever appears on the screen. Now, unless you're spending $4 to $8 grand on a computer screen and have true color, which I don't think even myself, right, is even useful, we have to start to be aware that something on our screen doesn't necessarily always print the same way. You guys may be familiar with this if you've ever printed from Photoshop and you're like, wow, it looked really great on the computer. Why does it look so dark? Or why this, why that? And very often I have to give you those tips and tricks. Honestly, the darkest color that I'd ever use looks more like the shading of a graphite pencil, right? And maybe not so much on a projector, right? Sorry, the projector. That's actually the color I'm looking for, right? But it starts to look more like the graphite. Do you guys remember your graphics 1 and 2 drawings? And when you saw them, they kind of shined a little, right, in the light. So effectively, what we're trying to do in a digital realm, guys, is we're not trying to make Toy Story 1. We're trying to look like Toy Story 4 over here. And do you guys know the difference between those? Have you guys seen Toy Story 1 and Toy Story 4? Toy Story 1 is laughable, right? Even though it looks really perfect, it almost looks too perfect, right? In fact, if you look, you know, there's perfectly symmetrical people. They have no blemishes or markings on the entire person, not a single pore, right? In Toy Story 4, they've got dirt all over them. They got scratches on the plastic. The plastic shines a little bit, sort of warped, right? You know, it's in fact the imperfections that make things look perfect, right? So, of course, try to be aware of that, especially as we continue. But anyway, we don't use true black. That way it starts to look more like a pencil, right? And don't get me wrong, you may not really notice digitally, right? But notice how we're zooming in. Does it ever get pixelated, guys? Never. Because, of course, it's a vector program, and it's going to print that straight as well and very unpixelated also. So the reason I say this and to say to use Illustrator is because, well, Photoshop does this to text too, and we don't want blurry text, we don't want pixelated text. So of course this is where you'd want to make your text and import your drawings. So not to get too ahead of myself, like I said, I have about 12 minutes left. So let's go ahead and talk about the layers, right? We did have a graphic scale layer that, you know, I can turn off now and turn back on, and we know that they're separated. However, if I click on this invisible box over here that you can't see, right, it actually selects everything in the layer, which is really useful because honestly, selecting all of these one at a time, I'm accidentally going to get other stuff, right? Which is why I say don't draw in Illustrator. So we basically just take everything in that layer and we change it. So in my case, I'm going to change the stroke. I'm going to say it's 0.5 thickness. Perfect. I'm going to double click on the color and I'm going to go with something of a more grayish tone, and voila, I just did them all at the exact same time. See the power of this though, right? We can go a lot faster for what we're trying to do. Now obviously we're not usually very fast the first time, but it'll get there. Now obviously the last thing this needs, oh, and that looks pretty nice. We can change these even individually as well. Another thing that I can do is, well, I can select one of these, and maybe I didn't layer them all out, or maybe they're accidentally the same layer. I can click on one of them, I can go to select, same, appearance, right? And it's actually going to highlight all the ones that are, of course, are close to each other. You may have saw that there was some different options, right? So if I go to select, same, fill color, oh, now it's just going to get these pieces, right? Select, obviously I got to deselect each time though. Select, same stroke weight, same stroke color. Obviously you can use this to your advantage, right? The same opacity. Anyway, what else? Let's go ahead and put an image in. Let's say I scanned an image. How many of you guys have scanned an image before? Hopefully so. You guys know about the flatbed scanner. Great, we don't have to cover that. So let's go ahead and maybe put one of those scanned images. I basically just have to find one for the sake of this tutorial. So we'd go to File, Place, and hopefully a little bit of a review for most of us, right? But just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Let's go over to SAC. Let's see what I got here. Graphics 3. Probably got something in here. Just place. Let's go with columns. Or sorry, icons. Let's put some trees in here. Why not? So I'm going to go ahead and place these 3 drawings. Maybe I have a photo montage or some sort of graphic. There we go. Alright, so maybe this is part of my process. And I've got an elevation. Awesome. However, you'll notice in here, now we can fill in the blanks. Right? And you'll notice it came in on a different layer, so maybe I actually make another layer. I'll call it, process. And what's nice is once I click on something, I can use that invisible box tool again and change that layer very simply. Right, I just drag this little box. Right, and of course it even changes color. Now obviously you don't want boxes everywhere, so you might obviously use the default for the tool that it is, kind of just as a placeholder, and then of course turn off that layer when you don't need it or before you print, right? But what's nice about this program is it's going to line up stuff for you, right? It's even going to, did you guys see that? It gets even the spacing between stuff, right? So definitely play around with it this weekend, as I know a lot of us will be starting to put this together, right? Now, what I would like to see is something on Monday, right? Even if it's just me flying by your computer, look, sir, I started, right? That's 100, right? But if you know me, I like to take daily grades, and they're kind of the worst and the best things. If I did something, I get 100 today. If I didn't do anything, I get a 0, right? So it's kind of an all or nothing kind of thing for me. However, I'm pretty lenient. If you were in the hospital all night, obviously I'm not going to be like 0, right? But I do give a lot of chances, but at the end of the day, guys, we're trying to train you for real life. And eventually, especially in architecture, if I don't show up to my work with one of the drawings for the deadline, do you think I'm going to have a job the next day? Probably not, right? Or not get a lot of chances. So by all means, we practice that very harshly at San Antonio College, right? Because we're preparing our students to understand the same rigor that the professional world has. Now, don't get me wrong, eventually getting paid to be in a studio, it's a good feeling, right? And being a student can be very difficult, especially in architecture. It's one of the hardest. So at least keep that in mind, that we're trying to train you for the real world, and we don't want to see you fail in the real world like we see in many other students. Anyway, let's say I actually needed to cut something out of this. I can't just right click and edit it in Photoshop. I could do that in InDesign, however, and we'll talk about that if we talk about InDesign for your portfolios, and we probably will by the very end. But let's say I kind of want to mask something out, and what's nice is I can mask in Photoshop and I can mask in Illustrator. The only thing I need is, of course, a box, so I'll use a rectangle tool and basically highlight this. Now, what's nice is I can actually make an invisible line. So if I click over this part, and if you kind of just sit there for a second, it typically has a little animation. Do it. There you go. Right? Fill and stroke. And what's funny is that these are interchangeable. Right? However, I can also make something invisible by clicking this little void. Right? Because I don't need that line to necessarily show up. I don't want a black box around my amazing photo that I just did in Photoshop. So I want to make them both invisible, and I'm going to select both of them. Once I have them both selected, if I right click and go to make clipping mask, it's going to essentially crop it out for me using that boundary. So let's say I use a different boundary, right? Let's say I draw my own boundary with the pen tool, right? Let's go ahead and do so. And let's say I have a crazy boundary. Maybe I really want to show off some of my skills, and I don't know, maybe it actually goes with my studio project or something. What is nice is that I do have the ability. So technically it's an invisible line, so I'll select them. Again, make clipping mask, and it's even going to follow that shape too, right? So whether it's a star, a lot of professors say to like fade out the drawing. I'm not a huge fan of that. I think it's kind of cheesy, and I'm not a huge fan of gradients because they look too digital. In my opinion, we already know it's digital, so do something digital, right? Now, I'm not saying you should do this to every drawing. Obviously, keep it square, keep it simple. You guys, have you ever heard what KISS stands for? Keep it simple, stupid, right? That is definitely a good rule to have in architecture. When in doubt, simplify, right? That was actually one of the sayings of one of the professors from here that, of course, no longer teaches here. Otherwise, this has really kind of just been the short introduction, right? Definitely somewhere to get started. And we do have a couple of options. We can either drag in our drawings from Rhino that we're already doing and simply add line weights, right, to those. Or we could Photoshop and scan our analog drawings and simply place them into Illustrator. Now, maybe the last thing to cover is obviously text. I think that goes a bit without saying. I click on the text tool, and of course add my text. It works basically as a box, and yes, it will put some Pig Latin in there just for filler, but this is where we can type the text. Anyway, obviously I can change the font, the size, and this is a pretty good architectural font. Eventually we'll start talking about these, but one thing I would say, how many of you guys know what sans serif font is? Good. Maybe a couple of us. Basically it means font without the little freelies, right? If you've ever seen Times New Roman, it's got these little curvature elements to it that sort of hang off the letter. Don't do that in architecture. We like clean, crisp, very readable lines. So some of the fonts that I like to use is like Myrid Pro, one of my favorites, Maven Light, right? And of course you can write these down. You're more than welcome to use them. But yeah, some of my favorites just because they're nice and soft and still get the point across, right? Very nicely. But again, there's definitely power to this line weight thing, guys. Not everything has to be black. Not everything has to be really light and unseeable. So finding that balance between your layers and the thickness and the size, as you can imagine, architects have a lot to deal with. Eventually it becomes second nature, so that's why we introduce them so early, right? Fair enough? Questions that maybe I can address that sort of popped up in your head and I can attach it to this video? Any questions at all? Don't be afraid. Some people, you know, I say ask that question because everybody else in the room might have that exact same question. And there's no such thing as a dumb question. None at all, guys? Helpful? Anything new? Maybe a little bit of review? Good. We'll go ahead and end it there then.